Hi. So, I'd like to get into talking about what survivors have to go through. Um, you know, in the beginning stages, but even throughout your journey. So, I'll get into a little bit. I talked on my last live about how things were with my son, my oldest. So, how I had to stay in the hospital for quite some time. So, everybody at the hospital knew what was going on, even though I didn't. But the doctors, the nurses, even like my OBGYN, when I would go for regular appointments, knew what was happening to me. They're trained in these things. So they definitely, oh, thank you. They definitely knew what was happening to me, but also they had social workers come during my stay to check in on me and talk with me and everything. So before my son was even born, I had the Department of Children and Families already there, ready for when my son was to be born. So once my son arrived, DCF showed at the hospital, and that's when they really started to talk about my safety, like where was I gonna go, because now that I had the baby, I can't live there. But the hospital did let us stay there for 5 days, which is longer than usual because I had a natural birth, and usually they only let you stay for 2 days if you and the baby are okay. And even though my son was born 36 weeks and 1 day, he was totally safe. He was good. So we didn't have to technically stay, but for my safety, the doctors had me and my son stay. So, like I said, the doctors and the nurses knew what was going on, and just didn't know how to get me to understand what was going on. But they did explain that what was happening is not okay, and because he was getting trespassed from the hospital, security had to write down they changed my name. So I was at St. Elizabeth's in Boston, and because St. Elizabeth's has different wings for maternity and everything, I was staying by St. Margaret or something like that for maternity. So my name was Margaret Saint, and then my son's name was Baby Saint. So nobody could look us up. Nobody knew that we were there, for our safety. And it's great that hospitals do that because, they were protecting me, even though I didn't even get it at the time. But yeah, they tried to explain it to me a few times. They really did not want me having him there for the birth, and so I didn't have him there for the birth. I mean, he was trespassed from the hospital, but I was so in the cycle that I'm I need to find a way to still be involved with him. I was just so deep in the cycle, I didn't understand. So thankfully the hospital had me understand that he shouldn't be there for the birth, and so he wasn't. And at one point they even said we need to have the Boston police be here. And so the Boston police came, and I filled out actually my water had just broken. My water just broke, and I was actively in labor. I think the police came around 12:30, and my son was born just before 5 o'clock. So I remember talking to the police and being terrified, because I was still deeply in love with my abuser. And I'm having this conversation with the police, and explaining things to them, and I'm like having contractions. It was definitely interesting, but I am very grateful that the police responded and took my report because that was now documented. So anyways, after that, my son was born, DCF came, and they started explaining, like, where are you going to go? And I'm like, I don't know, and I didn't quite have the language to explain that I was like even really being abused, or that like my family was also abusing me. So, I mean, I definitely did not want to go to my parents' house. Like, that was like out of the question. And when I was pregnant, I was living in an apartment, and my abuser would come to the apartment like here and there, abuse me, and then like go to his mom's house. So he didn't really live with me, but like he would come over a lot. And so then I lived in the hospital, and his family moved me out of that apartment because I was living in the hospital for 10 weeks. Like, that's like a little more, like a month or two or something like that. So there was no sense in like paying for the rent at that apartment anymore. So they moved me out. And then the plan was that I was gonna, because I was so deep in the cycle, the plan was that I was gonna go live at his mom's house, and we were gonna be this like happy family, which made no sense, but that was the plan. So when DCF, found out about that, they're like, no, you're being abused, you can't live there. And they specifically told me, like, if you can't keep your son safe, then we'll have to keep your son safe for you. And so that was terrifying. It was basically like I had just given birth, but like I didn't even have like a chance to be a mom yet, if that makes sense. Like, I was already, because I was also like becoming so honest. I explained early on in my pregnancy, I think I mentioned in a couple lives ago, that I was addicted to marijuana and I would numb myself. And so I was really scared when they told me I was pregnant, because I was like, oh my gosh, like I just did this. And they were like, it's okay. Just as long as you don't do it throughout the pregnancy, it's okay. And I was like, I'll never do it again. So I think they do this with every pregnancy, but like they actively like drug tested me like every time I went in for an appointment. So yeah. And so because I explained that and like disclosed that information to them, when my son was born, they didn't even like let me hold him. They immediately got social workers and like started to bag my son to test his urine to make sure like I really wasn't using, which was really scary, because like they were like, because of how serious everything was throughout my pregnancy, like they had NICU come in, like they had all these people like come in and check the baby first. But like I said, he was okay. But it was just scary because like I had just given birth and I didn't like, I'm like, can I hold my son? Like, am I allowed to hold my son? Like, I didn't get that experience. And I was like 24 and I really just wanted to be able to hold my son, but it took a while. Eventually, I think like it's the longest 15 minutes ever, but like eventually after like 15 minutes, they let me hold my son. But so yeah, like I said, DCF was like, you can't live with them. Like, you can't live with your abuser and his mom, and like you just can't live there. And I'm like, all right. So I had nobody. I'm like, I didn't again have the language to explain that I was also being abused by my parents and my sibling, mainly like my sisters. So at one point I had the thought like maybe I can live with my oldest sister, because she wasn't my parents. She weren't like, even like the abuse is different within the siblings, because like the parents are the parents and the siblings, like we were just kids. So it's hard to explain, but like ultimately, like even though we grew to be adults, like we were supposed to be being taught by our parents. So like our upbringing is what brought us to like where we are today, if that makes sense. So anyway, I thought like I could live with my oldest sister And, she just had a baby herself. So she had 3 kids. So I remember talking to her on the hospital phone, like, I can't live with you. And she's like, yeah, no, you can't live here. Like, you're going to have to go live with, like, mom and dad. And I'm like, there's no way I'm doing that. Like, I'm not living there. And DCF was like, you have to live there. It was either that or they were going to bring me into a shelter. And, like, I really didn't want to do that at the time. So it was almost like I had to pick between, like, abusers. Because I really didn't think I could, like, live in a shelter. Like, my sister had said, like, come on, like, just go live with mom and dad. Like, you think you can go live in a shelter? So I was like, yeah, I can't, So I lived with my mom and dad. That literally lasted, like, not even a month before the abuse was just, like, horrible. And if anything, they were making me feel, like, incompetent as a parent. Like, anytime, like, my son cried, like, my mom would come in and be like, what are you doing to him? And I'm like, what? I'm a mom and I'm learning. Like, you can't keep coming into the room to, like, I need to learn, So, but there was yelling, there was, like, it was just horrible. So I went back to thinking, how am I gonna, I missed a major part of the story. DCF said the only way I could keep my son is if I explained and proved to DCF that I was serious about the safety of my son. So they said, you need to get a restraining order. Like, they didn't force me, but they basically, like, gave me no option and said, like, you need to get a restraining order. And so I was, like, still deeply in love with my abuser. So I was like, I can't get a restraining order on him. Like, what do you mean? And they're like, yeah, like, you can get a no abuse order, you can get a restraining order, like, but you have to. And again, they didn't force me, but the language was kind of like, or you're going to take my son. So it was like, I really didn't have a choice. So I'm like, okay, that's what I have to do. So I did get the restraining order. And they granted it. They had the police reports, they had everything. But that was really scary because I was still in love with my abuser. So I, like, didn't want to. I had it in my mind that we were just going to still be fine. Like, he was still going to be, like, a dad, and, like, we were going to be this happy family. Like, I don't know what I was thinking, but I thought that for a while. But, like, in the very beginning, I had, like, domestic violence is so tricky, but, like, especially once you have, like, children in the mix. So yeah, I was just like, okay, but I'll get a restraining order on him because that's what they want me to do. But, like, I still love him, which is, like, makes no sense. But so I get the restraining order. I live with my parents for, like, maybe a month. And then I'm like, where do I go? So even though I got the restraining order, I was, like, talking to him that same day that I got the restraining order. Like, we were actively talking, like, every single day. So because we were talking so much, he was like, yeah, you can't live with your parents. And so I ended up living with his mom. And because of the restraining order, the mom was like, this is way too risky. Like, he's got to go live somewhere else. So I think he lived with a friend and I lived with his mom. But, like, he would go there all the time. So in actuality, like, I had this restraining order. I was absolutely terrified of him, but I was in love with him. So it's, like, really confusing because I would say, like, 90% of the time he was, like, unsafe, and then 10% he wasn't. So I was holding on to that 10% of him, and I was convinced that I could change him and, like, fix him and like, mother him. And basically, because I was born into domestic violence, I was taught to be codependent, and like, I could not imagine my life without my abuser. It was, like, sickening almost. Like, I became obsessed with the idea of fixing him and, like, changing him and, like, making him a good man. It makes no sense. Like, it really doesn't. But but I'm learning in therapy now that it actually does make sense, because that's what my brain was telling me to do, you know. It's what I was the environment that I was growing up in. Like, my mom and my dad, like, my dad would make every type of mistake and be as abusive as possible. And my mom would be like, but I love him. And then my dad would be like, I'm sorry. And my mom's like, it's okay. And then they're back to each other. And then they were in the cycle. I mean, I'm sure they still are, but I don't know. I haven't spoken to them, and I won't speak to them. But from the last I know, you know, years and years and years of them just being like, I love you, I hate you, I love you, I hate you. And it's like, it was almost like I didn't want that with me and my abuser. Like, I wanted it, I would always say, like, I don't want to be my parents. And then I would say to him, like, I don't want to be like your parents, you know? Like, they didn't like each other. They liked each other at one point, and then they didn't like each other. And then they, like, they had their own issues, like, with restraining orders and safety and, like, domestic violence. And so it's like, the only difference is, like, my parents stayed together and they didn't. Like, his parents got divorced. So, and, yeah, so anyway, so I ended up living with a mom. I lived with the mom. My abuser would, like, come over. But I lived with the mom until, I think, for like 2 months. And then she was like, you have to live in a shelter. Like, you can't live here anymore. And so that's when I went to go live in a shelter. My son was like 4 months old. I think he had just turned 4 months old, and I went to go live in a shelter. And it was near, like, the Cape area, and it was nice because I got to go to the beach, but I was, like, one of the only people living in the shelter that had a car. Most people that lived there didn't have a car. It was hard living in a shelter with, like, a newborn baby. I mean, like, I had a little room. They gave me a pack and play for my son to sleep in. And I honestly, like, felt safe, you know. But again, spoke to my abuser. Like, makes no sense. But I felt safe because I was, like, away from him. Like, he couldn't harm me. Like, he could verbally abuse me and, like, emotionally and mentally abuse me, like, through the phone, you know. But, like, at least it wasn't happening in person. And there were, like, curfews and rules. Like, I had chores. It was really hard at the shelter, honestly, because I would have to wear my son and, like, do chores and, like, scrub toilets and, like, do the dishes. And there were all these different types of chores that you would have to do. And I would have to, like, hold my, like, wrap my son. And, like, it was hard when I had to clean the bathrooms because I couldn't hold him when I was doing that. Like, sometimes I could, but, like, when I was using, like, bleach and stuff, like, I didn't. So I'd have to put him in the pack and play in the hallway. But yeah, so the shelter, so I lived in the shelter until my son was, like, maybe 6 months old, maybe, like, 6.5 months old. And then, you know, I had no money. I wasn't working. That was another thing, is I was a loss prevention agent. So I went to school. I went to college for criminal justice, ironically. So I got my bachelor's degree in criminal justice. And then I got pregnant with my son, and I graduated college. And so I would work in, like, security. And then that's when I was a loss prevention agent. And I worked all the way up until I was about, like, 7 months pregnant. And, like, I had to take medical leave, and that's when I lived in the hospital. So it was a great job. It was for, like, Gap Inc. So I got to be on maternity leave. So first I was on medical leave, then I was on maternity leave. It was, like, a big job. Like, I had never had a job like that before. So I was grateful because I had that. But I wasn't making, like, an income, really. I was just making, like, what they could give me for maternity leave. And then, so I'm living in the shelter and had to figure out what I was going to do. I still had the restraining order on my children's father, but wasn't listening to it. And, you know, the shelter, they try to get you, there's like this company that's called Home Base, and they try to get you like on your feet. So they help you with like first, last security, and they get you going. So that's how it works for the state of Massachusetts, at least. And they want you to like have a job, because they only pay for first, last, and security, and like you have to take care of it. Like they're not just gonna like pay forever. So I think it's like $8,000. I mean, this was in 2016, so it might have changed now, but back then that's what it was, $8,000. So whatever was left out of first, last security, they paid like half of that, and I would have to pay the rest. So I needed to get a job. So I had to leave loss prevention. I had my son now. Like I couldn't, that was an intense job anyway. Like I was apprehending shoplifters, and it got pretty dangerous at times. And I was like, I have a son now. I can't work there anymore. So they understood. And then I'm like, I have to work. So I thought, I used to babysit as a kid. So I'm like, I could be a nanny. And so it worked. I became a nanny, and I brought my son to work with me, which was like ideal. I didn't have to pay for childcare or anything like that. And I was like scared to leave my son. I had a lot of abandonment issues and trust issues. And so I was just grateful that I was able to bring him to work with me and get paid. They were a really great family. They did not know about my situation at all, but I still talk to them to this day. They're beautiful people. So, and my son got to like grow up with their daughter. It was just really sweet. They're about 6 months apart from each other. So, but yeah, so I became a nanny, and then the shelter doesn't want you living there for too long. They try to like get you out as fast as possible, because they need to give beds to other women and children. So yeah, I had to basically, wherever they thought I could go is where I should go, they said. So it was like they found this apartment in Fall River, and I'm like this small town girl. I did not know what Fall River was, but I had heard some things, and I was like, well, I mean, it's not a shelter. So I go see the apartment, and it is in the middle of the day, and there's a playground. And at first I was like, oh, this is great. Like, it's not a shelter, It was a 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor, and I saw it once, and I was like, it's not a shelter. Like, I'll go there. And so I go to this new apartment, and when I get there, so now I'm moving in. It's like a couple days later. I'm moving in, and the people on the 1st and 2nd floor were like, you're moving in here? You have this baby? I'm like, yeah, 'cause my son was like maybe 6.5 months or so now. And they're like, you're gonna live here? And I was like, yeah. They're like, you can't live here. Like, bring your I don't know why you think you're moving in here, but you can't live here. And I was like, why can't I live here? And they started telling me like horror stories, like that there's, again, small town girl, really was not exposed to, I mean, I was exposed to a good amount of stuff, but not what they were explaining. They were explaining like a lot of crime, of like gangs and drugs, and there was like shootings like 2 days ago, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I don't think I can live here. So I had to get out of there. And I called the shelter, and I'm like, I can't live there. Like, well, you already signed the lease. Like, there's nothing we can do for you. We already gave your bed up to someone else. And I'm like, well, what do I do? They're like, can't help you. So then I go back into the Department of Transitional Assistance, which is where I first like found the shelter. And they're like, once you go to a shelter, like you can't go like back for another 2 years. Like, that's the whole point of a shelter. They get you an apartment, and then you can't go back to a shelter for 2 years. And I'm like, well, then where do I go? They're like, don't know. So I ended up calling a friend and telling them the situation, and they were like, I'm going to help you. And they paid for a motel for one night. And I was still working. I was still a nanny. So I had to like pretend I wasn't homeless. Like, you know, I'm like living out of my, so I slept at the hotel for one night, and then that's all my friend could afford. And then I'm like, what do I do now? You know? Meanwhile, my family was like, they had no idea about any of this, and I was hiding from them. I'm like, I can't be near my family. Like, they're like part of this problem. So, but yeah, I end up going to work with everything that I own, basically, and not knowing what to do. I ended up I went to private Catholic schools like my whole life, so I ended up going to my elementary, middle school church and walked in and just was like, can I talk to someone? Like, I need help. And I don't know even where I thought of that idea, but I just thought, like, I need help, you know, so a church will help me. And it was probably God, definitely God. So I walked into the church, explained my situation. There's a company that's called St. Vincent de Paul, and they help like people like me, which I didn't even know about. So then St. Vincent de Paul comes, and they're like, we're going to help you. And then they helped me move into a motel for about 2 months. I lived at that motel, and they helped me pay for that. And then eventually, I was able to get my home base back, like with the help of a lawyer and like the state representative. And then I got to live in my apartment, and I lived at that apartment for like 3 years. It was such a difference from like living in a shelter and then a motel and then having like an apartment. It was definitely interesting. That's like a conversation for a whole nother day, but I was just grateful that I was out of the shelter and out of a motel. It was hard living in a motel. And my nanny family had no idea that I was like living like this. And all this time I didn't even have therapy. I don't think I did. Or I might have had one therapist, but I like wasn't completely honest. Like, nobody knew I was still talking to my abuser, but his family did. Which is always so interesting to me, because it's like his family, still to this day probably, like protected him at all costs. You know, they knew I had a restraining order on him. They knew like what he was doing, and they knew that I was like, it's just weird when you actually think about it. But yeah, only his family knew, and that was like part of the abuse that he had over me. Was like, oh, you don't want to get in trouble, do you? Like, because I could easily just say you're not scared of me because you see me all the time, even though I was still scared of him. Like, it's really confusing. Domestic violence is very confusing. But I was very much afraid of him, but I was also in love with him. So that's like, and it's the same with family. Like, with my family, it was like I was afraid of them, but I loved them, you know? Like, I still have love for my family. Like, I don't think that'll ever go away, but I do know that they're abusive at the same time. So it's really tricky domestic violence is just very tricky. And domestic violence is the reason why, like, my family would be domestic violence is because I lived in the home with them, and like they're my upbringing. And then like anything intimate partner is domestic violence as well. So like if you got into a physical altercation with your cousin and you like didn't live together and you were like cousins, that would be like an assault. But anyone like living in the family home with one another or intimate partner is considered domestic violence. So yeah, so I could keep talking for days on days. I really want to keep digging into what I was just sharing, because there's so much more there to talk about. So, but thank you for those who joined and who will listen later, and take care.